Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the miracles of Jesus in our continuing study of the life of Christ. Matthew chapter 8, verse 1 says, "When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him." Now, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapters 8 and 9, and of course this is right on the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So let's back up and look at what Matthew has been doing. We've mentioned this already, so this is by way of review, how Matthew's account starts with the birth narrative of Jesus. Jesus is born. And then in chapter 2, there was the king ordering the murder of the infants. Herod the Great, remember, did that. And then in chapter 3, we have the baptism of Jesus. And we noted last time that these events sound very much like the life of Moses. Moses is born, and then there's the Pharaoh ordering the birth of the infants, and then he leads the Israelites through the Red Sea. He goes on to, we see where they're tempted for 40 years in the wilderness. In the case of Jesus, he's baptized, that's his going through the waters, and he's tested in the wilderness, not for 40 years, but for 40 days. Then we have the Sermon on the Mount. We liken that to the law being given on the mountain in the days of Moses. And I'm going to suggest there's a sense in which a little bit of that pattern continues. Moses is given the law, and then after that he comes down with the 10 Commandments. Jesus gives the law on his Sermon on the Mount. That's Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And then what we have in Matthew chapters 8 and 9 are not 10 Commandments, but 10 miracles. So let's look at those by way of an overview, and then we'll go through them one by one. First of all, there's the leper being cleansed. Secondly, a centurion servant is healed. Thirdly, Peter's mother-in-law is healed of a fever. So we have 3 healings. Then the storm is stilled. Jesus and his disciples are on the Sea of Galilee, and he calms the storm with a single word. And number 5 is where demons are cast into the swine. A man is demon-possessed. They're taken from him, and they're allowed to go into a herd of pigs. Those are the first 5. Notice that the next 5 are going to have a corollary to the first 5. The first one was a sermon being healed. Now there is a paralytic being healed, so I have a healing. A synagogue official's daughter is raised from the dead, so we have a healing regarding the either servant or daughter of a person in authority. So the centurion was a person in authority. Now the synagogue official, he's somebody in authority, and his daughter is healed. We had Peter's mother-in-law being healed, and we had a woman with an issue of blood. So there's a woman and a woman. We had the storm being stilled, and you say, wait a minute, there's 2 blind men who were healed. How does that correlate? In both of those, there's a reference to faith. They're told, the disciples are told when the storm is stilled, you have little faith. And the 2 blind men are told, your faith has made you whole. And finally, there's a demon-possessed man who's delivered. So demons cast into swine, that's a demon, an exorcism, demons cast out of someone. And again, demons are cast out of someone. Now let's begin those. Matthew chapter 8, verse 2, "And a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.'" I love the way he says this. Not just, please cleanse me, but it's an expression of faith. The only question is Jesus willing to do it? He's got the ability, though, to make him clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Now that's significant, because you didn't go around touching lepers, because touching a leper would make you unclean. Both the very fact that you could contract the disease, but also it made you ceremonially unclean. But it doesn't do that to Jesus, because when Jesus touches the leper is cleansed. And he says, I am willing, be cleansed, and immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So instead of Jesus becoming unclean, the leper becomes clean through this touch. And Jesus said to him, "See that you tell no one." Now that brings up a question. Jesus is going to say this on a number of occasions. He will say, I'm going to do a miracle. But don't tell anyone. Instead, go, show yourself to the priest, and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. This is going back to the Old Testament law that had the law of the leper, where if a leper was cleansed, and I imagine that hardly ever happened. In fact, can you imagine if you're a priest and you're working in the temple, and all of a sudden somebody comes in and says, "I've been cleansed of leprosy. Isn't there something in the law?" And they say, "Oh yeah, there is. Gee, I need to go back and look that up again. We hardly ever use that." Matter of fact, maybe they'd never use that. But that's going to be a testimony to them. So he's not to just go spread the news indiscriminately, but rather that news will be spread through the law, through the observance of the law. Now, next we read when Jesus entered Capernaum. He's going to be making Capernaum his base of operations here on the Sea of Galilee, on the northwestern side of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum's a little tiny town. Had a synagogue right in the middle, and you had a number of these little homes that are all joined together. And the reason you would join them together is when you had children and they grew up and got married, they would just come right next door and build on to yours. So you have these couple little family groups, and they're all related to one another. Everybody knows everyone in town. You go to the synagogue at Capernaum today, and there's a 3rd century synagogue that's still standing. The 3rd century synagogue is built right over top of the original synagogue that would have been there in Jesus' day, looking probably very much the same. And when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented." Jesus said to him, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion said, "Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under," here's that key word, "authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled, and said to those who were following, "Truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel." Here's a Roman centurion, part of the occupying force of Rome, and he demonstrates faith in the authority of Jesus. And Jesus marvels. He says, "I say to you that many will come from the east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." Notice what he's saying is the kingdom is going to have kingdom people there that are not just Jewish. They're going to come from the east and the west. Those are places where there were not Jewish people necessarily. Conversely, verse 12, "But the sons of the kingdom," that is, the Jewish people, the people who are physically sons, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, "will be cast out into the outer darkness. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, it shall be done for you as you have believed." And the servant was healed at that very moment. So Jesus does a healing, a long distance healing, from his own authority. When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law, that is Peter's mother-in-law. By the way, if you have a mother-in-law, that means you're married. Peter, the other apostles presumably as well, had wives. There was nothing about, you're more spiritual if you don't get married. Now there are some things that Paul will say later on about celibacy that can be a good thing. But here, Peter has a mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law is lying sick in bed with a fever, and he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up. And notice, it's a complete restoration. She got up and waited on him. She's not just healed, but she's healed and strengthened and able to get up and serve. When evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word. Notice with a word, that's speaking of his authority, and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill which was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. Isaiah gives a prophecy about how Messiah would take away infirmities and carry away diseases. That was not just speaking of spiritual infirmities and spiritual diseases. Jesus actually healed physically to show that he has the authority to heal spiritually as well. Now, when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. He's going to go across the Sea of Galilee. This open, we would call it a lake, but they called it the Sea of Galilee. Then a scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Here he's leaving Capernaum. He's going to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And here's someone that voices his intent to follow him. And Jesus said to him, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." You want to follow me. He is presenting him the cost of what that will be. Because Jesus, the one that he wants to follow, doesn't have a nice cushy home he's got no place on which to lay his head. He has left his divine prerogative in heaven to come and be what looks like a wanderer on the earth. Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, I'm going to come, but permit me first to go and bury my father." Now, it may well be, I can't say for sure, it may well be that his father hadn't died yet. That he's saying, let me take care of these, home issues and get my inheritance, and then I'll be all set to serve you. But Jesus said to him, "Follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead." And so Jesus insists that he be the priority. If you're going to follow him, you must make him your priority. Verse 23, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea. Now, that's not a regular thing on the Sea of Galilee. Yes, you can occasionally have wind sweep down from the hills, and it can churn up a bit. But this seems to be bigger than normal. And I got a chance in Israel to visit a museum there where they had found a boat that had been sunk, and they were able to pull it up and restore it. And of course, it's 2,000 years old, so it doesn't look like much. But as I looked at it, I was just moved by the fact that even in its best day, I don't know if I would have been wanting to be out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee on this boat, especially if a storm came up. So here a great storm arose on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was asleep. He had gone to the back of the boat. He's asleep in the boat. And they came to him and they woke him. Notice this. Yes, it was a storm, but it wasn't enough to wake him up. And they woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?" We've just had an example of great faith, the great faith of the centurion, the Roman pagan who showed great faith in Jesus. And here are those who were brought up believing in a living God, and Jesus calls them, "You men of little faith." He rebukes them. And then he gets up and he rebukes the wind and the sea. And he said to his disciples, "You men of little faith," and then he says to the wind and the sea, "Quiet!" And it gets quiet. And it became perfectly calm. And the men were amazed and said, "What kind of a man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" You see, what's being pictured throughout is the authority of Jesus. The centurion, a man of authority, recognized that authority in somebody else. And here even the wind and the sea recognize his authority. "What kind of a man is this?" I can go out and talk to the wind and the waves all day, and they're not going to listen to me because I don't have that kind of authority. But Jesus did. When he came to the other side, into the country of the Gadarenes, that's on the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee, 2 men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. Now, some of the other accounts only mention one of these men, but here in Matthew we're told there were 2 men. They were coming out of the tombs. They were so extremely violent that no one could pass that way. They had constituted a public menace. And they cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" They recognize, here are these unclean spirits, these demons that are possessing these 2 men. They recognize the authority of the Son of God. Now, there was a herd of many swine feeding at a distance from them. Swine. What are swine doing in Galilee? Well, they're on the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. That's not the Jewish side. That's the Gentile side. That's the place, yes, you might have the occasional Jewish person, but you're going to have a great deal more Gentiles because this is the area that's known as the Decapolis, the Greek 10 cities, the 10 Greek cities. And for the Greeks, they eat pigs. In fact, they eat pigs and they sacrifice pigs. Pigs to the Greeks were what lambs and sheep were to the Jews. So there was this herd of swine. They're feeding at a distance from them. And the demons began to entreat him, saying, "If you're going to cast us out, then send us into the herd of swine." Apparently they don't want to be just cast out and be homeless. Can you allow us to enter this herd of unclean animals? I guess that's appropriate. They're unclean spirits. They can enter the unclean animals. And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and they went into the swine, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank. There are steep banks. You can see it in the distance as you're looking at that across the sea at that southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. They rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the waters. Notice they end up destroying this herd. The herd, doesn't stay nice and comfortably demon-possessed, but it brings about destruction, which in a sense is a picture of what unclean spirits always do. They bring about destruction. Maybe not immediate, but they are destroyers. And the herdsman ran away and went to the city and reported everything, including what had happened to the demoniacs. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they implored him to leave their region. "Can you please go away somewhere else?" So it's a measure of faith. They believe that Jesus really did this, but it's not a faith that embraces the good news. It's a faith that shuns it. And so for the time being, they ask Jesus to leave their region. And he does. And getting into a boat, Jesus crossed over the sea, and he came to his own city. So he's coming back to Capernaum. And here in Capernaum, they brought to him a paralytic, lying on a bed. Someone who was paralyzed. Now, we don't know what it was. Is this muscular? Is this... we don't know. We're not told. But he's unable to move. And they bring him. All he can do is lie there. Notice, seeing their faith. It's not just the faith of the paralytic, although that might have been there too. But it's the faith of those who bring him. We're told in the other gospel accounts they had actually lowered him. He was in a crowded room, and they removed part of the thatch, I don't know if it was thatch roof, whatever the ceiling was, and they lower him through the roof. And seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralytic, "Take courage, son, your sins are forgiven." Now, there's some of the scribes that were there. And they said, wait a minute, that sounds like blasphemy. This fellow blasphemes. After all, only God can forgive sins. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, why are you thinking evil in your heart? Which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? Well, the truth of the matter is that neither one can be done by just a normal person. Oh, I can say your sins are forgiven, but I can't really do that. But if I say your sins are forgiven, it's easy to say because there's no evidence. You can't see the sin. But when you say get up and walk, I can see if somebody gets up and walk. And so he says, but so that you may know that the Son of Man has, there's that word again, authority. This has been all about the authority of Jesus. That's why the miracles are given. The miracles are to show, to demonstrate his authority. But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Then he said to the paralytic, get up, pick up your bed, and go home. And he got up, and he went home. The idea is he picked up his bed, and he went home. He has the authority, both to tell a lame man, a paralyzed man, to get up and walk, and also to forgive sins. Jesus has that kind of authority. But when the crowd saw this, they were awestruck and glorified God who had given such authority to men. They get the point. Authority has been given, and Jesus is manifesting that kind of authority. Back in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, we had kicked off with this word. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, not as the scribes. And now that authority is being demonstrated throughout by his miracles, by his power, by his supernatural abilities, showing his authority. In fact, that's the way Matthew is going to end. When we get to Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, Jesus will come up and speak to his disciples saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And then he's going to say, now go make disciples of all the nations, because you have that kind of authority. Well, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew. Now that's the same Matthew who gives his name to this book, presumably the one who wrote this book. There's this man called Matthew, sitting in the tax collector's booth. A tax collector, that might be an unpopular sort of thing, but especially a tax collector who's working for Rome, who's in Israel, because Israel's an occupied nation, would be especially unpopular. He would be viewed as a traitor to his own people, who had purchased the right to collect taxes so that he could overcharge people on their taxes. That's how he would make his profits. Here's this man Matthew doing that, sitting at the tax collector's booth. And he, that is Jesus, said to him, follow me. And he got up and followed him. This little tax collector who'd only been interested in money now follows Jesus. Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, we know from the other gospel accounts, that's in the house of the same Matthew. He invites him to a party. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came. If one comes, the word gets out. Jesus he'll speak, he'll converse with, he'll communicate, he'll fellowship with you, even if you're a tax collector, even if you're a sinner. And when he says tax collectors and sinners, that's not just sinners like all of us, that's special sinners. Those were sinners who were known by everybody to be real sinners. As though we're not all real sinners. We are. But many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and with his disciples. Now, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, notice they don't come to Jesus, they sort of go behind his back, they go to his disciples. Why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and sinners. We're Pharisees. We have separated ourselves from that kind of sin. But when Jesus heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick." Every once in a while I meet somebody who feels they're just not good enough to go to church. I say, not good enough to go to church? That's like being not healthy enough to go to a hospital. You go to a hospital because you're sick. You go to Jesus because you need a physician. You need healing. You need forgiveness. It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. And he's quoting now from the Old Testament. "I desire compassion and not sacrifice." Now, the sacrificial system was given in the Old Testament. But the Lord just didn't want sacrifices. He wanted compassion. "I desire compassion and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Jesus came not to save righteous people, not to make righteous people a little bit nicer, but he came to save sinners. Then the disciples of John came to him. Now notice, first we had the Pharisees going to the disciples of Jesus. Now we have the disciples of John coming to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't fast?" Fasting was a regular habit to the Pharisees, and likewise to the disciples of John. But they notice the disciples of Jesus, they haven't missed a meal. They are there eating with the tax collectors and with the sinners, and it looks like they're having a nice time. They're partying. Jesus is known as something of a, can I use this term? A party animal. By comparison. And Jesus said to them, "The attendants of the bridegroom cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast." Now is not the time of fasting, but it will come when I'm no longer there with them. Then they will fast. But no one puts a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment, and a worse tear results. Nor do people put new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wineskins burst, and the wine pours out, and the wineskins are ruined, but they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved. Now that's a parable. What does it mean in light of this? The disciples of John the Baptist have been looking at the Pharisees and saying, man, that's the way we've been going. And in doing so, they are like an old garment. They're looking at this old garment of religion, of the sacrificial system. And Jesus says, I am like a new cloth. And I won't fit on that old garment. I am like new wine. I won't fit in that new wineskin. I'm going to burst forth. And I'm going to be bigger than that. And you will actually see me tearing away and ruining that old wineskin. While he was saying these things to them, a synagogue official came. Now we had a centurion before. This time it's a official. He comes and bows down before him and he says to him, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and began to follow him. So did his disciples. And a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I will make well." And sure enough, that happens. But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, "Daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well." Now that's an ongoing theme that we've seen throughout. On the one hand, the authority of Jesus, and on the other hand, the value of faith in him. And at once the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the official's house, we're back to that. Notice how we started with the official's house, and they were on their way, and then we had the healing of the woman, sort of sandwiched in there, and then Jesus arrives at the official's house and saw the flute players and the crowd in the noisy disorder. He said, "Leave, for the girl has not died, but is asleep." Now, he'd been told earlier she has died. And now he says, all you folks that are here for the funeral, you can go home. There's not going to be a funeral. She's just asleep. And they began laughing at him. But when the crowd had been sent out, he entered and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. He wakes her. I think she had died, but he raises her from the dead. And this news spread throughout all the land. As Jesus went on from there, we have the next healing. Notice it's one right after the other, As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out, "Have mercy on us." And notice the title they give to him, Son of David. That is a messianic title. That's a kingly title. They are ascribing to him the title of royalty. When he entered the house, the blind men came up to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" And they said to him, "Yes, Lord." And then he touched their eyes, saying, "It shall be done to you according to your faith." Again, pointing out the value of faith. And the point is, they're believing on him because he has the authority to do this sort of thing. The idea of his authority and their faith is connected. And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, saying, "See that no one knows about this." But, in this case, they don't obey. But they went out and spread the news about him throughout all the land. Now, Jesus is not saying, "Here, spread the news about me." Rather, he's letting it spread naturally. And it is spreading throughout all that land. As they were going out, a mute, demon-possessed man was brought to him. Now, the last time we saw demons, they had not been mute. They'd been speaking. They'd been saying, "Lord, cast us into these swine." Here's someone who's unable to talk, and he's brought to Jesus. And after the demon was cast out, notice the casting out of the demon is almost superfluous. It's almost anticlimactic. After the demon was cast out, the mute man spoke, and the crowds were amazed and were saying, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." And notice even the enemies of Jesus, they cannot deny the real and obvious power of that which is taking place. But, verse 34, but the Pharisees were saying, "He casts out demons by the ruler of the demons." In other words, they are pointing to his power, and they're saying that's satanic power. They cannot deny the power, so they are denying the source of the power. Now, they're going to come back and do this again in a couple of chapters. But so this is setting the stage for what we'll see in the future. Jesus was going through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. He is showing his power. Now, this is a repeating of what we had seen earlier in Matthew chapter 4, verse 23. Where Jesus was going through all Galilee, teaching their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel in the kingdom, healing every kind of disease, every kind of sickness among the people. Here again, verse 35, Jesus was going through all the cities and villages, teaching their synagogues, proclaiming all the gospel of the kingdom, healing every kind of disease, every kind of sickness. We have almost word for word the same thing being said. So we're setting up a pattern, and it's going to be said again. We're setting up a pattern showing that this was part and parcel of the ministry of Jesus. And so, just as we had his Sermon on the Mount, this was the introduction for that. So also, this is going to be the introduction for the next sermon that Jesus will give, and it will be a sermon on discipleship. Seeing the people, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest." We need shepherds. We need pastors. We need workers. He says to his disciples, pray for the Lord to send workers. And then as we turn the page to chapter 10, Jesus is going to say, have you prayed? then now I'm sending you and you and you and you, and he's going to choose his 12 apostles.